Welcome to the channel. We're so excited to have you here as we dive into today's story. Whether you're watching from the heart of London or from the comfort of your home, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and share. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you won't miss tomorrow's special episode. We've got a lot more captivating stories coming your way, and we can't wait to have you along for the ride. This tourist thought he could get away with it, but the Royal Guard had other plans. Jake Williams had always believed that his wealth and status made him better than others. Growing up in a privileged family in New York, he was used to getting whatever he wanted. Money opened doors, and with that came a sense of entitlement. He had traveled the world, visiting countless countries, but never once did he stop to learn about the cultures he encountered. Instead, he saw them as just another place to tick off his list, another opportunity to show off his superiority. He never bothered to understand the people or the traditions that made those places special. To Jake, his money, his family name, and his connections were all he needed to feel untouchable, like the rules of the world didn't apply to him. Jake's life was one of luxury, but also one of arrogance. His friends, who came from similar backgrounds, shared in his belief that their wealth and status made them superior to others. They would often laugh at people who weren't as fortunate, making jokes about how they had it easy, how the world should be grateful for people like them. But beneath it all, Jake never realized that his arrogance would one day catch up with him, that the sense of power he felt from his money and position would be tested in ways he never expected. One bright afternoon, while on a trip to London, Jake and his friends stood outside the grand Buckingham Palace, eagerly waiting to see the famous royal guards. The imposing palace gates loomed tall, and tourists crowded the area, taking pictures of the guards in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. The guards stood motionless, completely still, no matter how many people stared or how much noise the crowd made. Jake, who had always prided himself on being the center of attention, saw this as the perfect opportunity for a challenge. "I bet I can make one of them blink," Jake said with a sly grin, nudging his friend standing next to him. His friends laughed, knowing that the royal guards were trained to remain still no matter what. Jake, however, was convinced that he could break their discipline. He saw it as a game where he would prove his superiority over something as seemingly invincible as the royal guard. The challenge was set. Jake and his friends slowly edged closer, pushing past other tourists in the process. As they neared the guards, Jake spotted one in particular, a tall, strong-looking man who stood with an air of unwavering focus. The guard was no ordinary man, though Jake didn't care to know his name or background. To Jake, this was just another person, someone who was beneath him, someone who would be part of his game. "Watch this," Jake whispered, grinning as he turned to face his friends. His voice was full of excitement, eager to show off. He began with simple tricks, waving his hand in front of the guard's face, making silly faces and sticking out his tongue. To Jake's frustration, the guard didn't react. In fact, none of the other tourists seemed to notice either. A few frowns appeared from people nearby, but Jake dismissed them. Then Jake took things a step further. "This guy doesn't even blink," he joked loudly, pointing directly at the guard. "Hey, can you hear me? Are you even real?" His friends burst into laughter, encouraging him to continue. Jake's sense of confidence grew, and his actions became more aggressive. "You don't even belong here, man," Jake muttered under his breath, staring the guard down. "I thought the Queen's guards were supposed to be, I don't know, British?" A few tourists gasped and began to move away, sensing that Jake had crossed a line. Some murmured quietly to each other, disapproving of his behavior, but Jake wasn't fazed. To him, it was still a joke, a way to prove that nothing was beyond his reach. He continued taunting the guard, leaning in closer and whispering, "Do you even speak English?" The guard remained silent and still. He had been trained for moments like this, trained to ignore the distractions, the taunts, and the mockery. His focus was unwavering. But inside, he knew that if Jake went any further, there would be consequences. Little did Jake know he was about to make a mistake that would change the course of this encounter, and potentially his life. Jake's confidence only grew with every taunt he threw at the royal guard. His friends, laughing and egging him on, were now fully engaged in what Jake saw as a harmless game. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had started to notice the spectacle, some frowning, others stepping back, sensing that the situation was becoming uncomfortable. But Jake didn't care. The more the crowd reacted, the more he pushed. He was determined to prove that no one was untouchable, not even the royal guards. The guard, a tall, powerful man named Elijah, stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward. To Jake, Elijah wasn't a person. He was just a figure in a uniform, a challenge to his ego. But the longer Elijah stood unmoving, the more Jake pushed to get a reaction. He had always gotten what he wanted in life. His money, his status, and his charm had made people bend to his will, and this was no different. If anyone could break Elijah's stoic discipline, it would be Jake. Jake took another step closer, the distance between him and the guard shrinking to just a few feet. His friends chuckled nervously, but they continued to watch, almost like they were enjoying the spectacle. Jake's eyes glinted with excitement. He raised his hands and waved them in front of Elijah's face. No reaction. Jake's grin only widened. "This is getting boring," he muttered under his breath, making exaggerated, silly faces in front of the guard. "Come on, man. Show me you're real." He waited for something, a flicker of acknowledgement, a shift in Elijah's gaze, even a subtle blink, but nothing. The guard remained perfectly still, unyielding, as if Jake were nothing more than a distant annoyance. Jake glanced around at the tourists nearby, some frowning in disapproval, others silently watching. But it was clear no one was supporting him. One woman shook her head, muttering something about disrespect. Jake ignored them. His eyes locked back onto the guard, and his impatience began to show. "This guy doesn't even blink," Jake said loudly, hoping to get a reaction. He wanted to see some sign that Elijah, too, was just a man like him. "Hey, can you hear me? Are you even real?" A few people gasped in disbelief, taking a step back. Some started to record on their phones, but Jake didn't back down. He was enjoying the attention, even if it was at the expense of someone else. He looked to his friends, a smirk on his face. "I thought the Queen's guards were supposed to be, I don't know, British?" Jake's voice was louder now, mocking, and the crowd grew quieter. Some tourists began to walk away, sensing the growing discomfort. Others simply watched, unsure how far Jake would go. But Jake was far from finished. He wanted more. He didn't care if people disapproved. This was his moment to shine. He leaned in even closer to Elijah, almost nose to nose with the guard. His voice dropped to a taunting whisper. "Do you even speak English?" For the first time, the silence around them felt heavy. A few people murmured, their unease palpable. A young man with a camera stepped forward and spoke up, his voice firm but calm. "Hey, leave him alone." Jake spun around, his smile turning into a sneer. "Mind your own business," he snapped, dismissing the young man with a wave of his hand. He turned back to Elijah, completely ignoring the growing discomfort around him. The royal guard stood tall, unmoving, his face a mask of professionalism. Elijah's training had prepared him for moments like this. He had been taught to ignore distractions, to focus solely on his duty, no matter how disrespectful, no matter how much people provoked him. But inside, Elijah knew one thing. If Jake took things any further, there would be consequences. He had been patient, disciplined, and calm, but Jake's actions were pushing him to a breaking point. Elijah had held his ground, but Jake was beginning to cross a line that would demand a response. Greg's words, his taunts and mockery were no longer just a joke. Elijah was ready to act, and Jake was about to find out that not all games end with laughter. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace shifted as the tension grew. Jake, still feeling the rush of power and amusement, had pushed the limits of respect and common decency. He had mocked the royal guard for far too long, and the audience of tourists around him, now quiet and uneasy, seemed to be holding their breath. Some were watching with discomfort, others recording the scene, but no one was laughing anymore. Jake wasn't satisfied. His ego, fed by his privileged upbringing, convinced him that he could get away with anything. He had taunted Elijah, the royal guard who stood still as a statue, unaffected by any of Jake's antics, but still, no reaction. The guard remained unwavering, his focus never leaving the front, his posture unshaken. To Jake, this was a test of power, a challenge he couldn't back down from. The thought of being ignored, of being dismissed so completely, gnawed at him. His friends, once laughing along, had fallen silent, perhaps realizing the situation was spiraling out of control. But Jake wasn't going to stop. He couldn't let himself look weak in front of them. His confidence built with every moment Elijah remained silent. Every second the guard didn't flinch. With one last glance at his friends, Jake smirked. He was determined to win this game. He leaned in closer to Elijah, his breath now just inches from the guard's face. His fingers twitched in anticipation, and a wild thought passed through his mind. He reached out gently, almost playfully, to grab Elijah's hat. A loud gasp rippled through the crowd. The moment Jake's hand made contact with Elijah's bearskin hat, a deep sense of discomfort spread among the onlookers. The hat, a symbol of the royal guard's duty, was sacred. Touching it was a clear violation of tradition, an act of disrespect that no one would take lightly. Elijah didn't move, not an inch. But Jake could feel it. The air around them had changed. The crowd was no longer laughing. The whispers of disapproval grew louder, and some people took a step back, sensing the rising tension. Elijah's body remained completely still, but Jake could see it. His stance had subtly shifted. It was a warning. Jake, however, couldn't stop himself. He felt a rush of control, as if he had proven his point. He twisted the hat between his fingers, laughing to himself. "It's just a hat, what's the big deal?" he said, as if dismissing the importance of the very tradition he was mocking. He grinned, enjoying the spectacle he had created. But the crowd wasn't amused. They were uncomfortable, and some started recording the incident on their phones. The energy in the air felt different now, heavier, as though everyone knew that Jake had crossed a line. The tension was palpable. Still, Elijah did not react. Jake's friends were starting to look uneasy, unsure of how far he was willing to take this, but Jake was still riding high on his arrogance. "Come on," he said, chuckling. "You're just standing there like a statue. Bet you wish you were somewhere else." He was pushing it, and deep down he knew it. At that moment something shifted in Elijah's posture. It wasn't anger, it wasn't violence, it was control. Elijah took a single, deliberate step forward. The sound of his boots clicking sharply on the stone floor cut through the growing silence. The crowd stopped moving. They stopped breathing. The shift in the air was palpable. Jake froze. For the first time, Jake felt a cold rush of realization. He had underestimated Elijah. He had pushed too far. Elijah, with his unwavering discipline and training, had simply waited. He hadn't moved when Jake grabbed his hat. He hadn't flinched when Jake mocked him. But now, as Jake stood directly in front of him, Elijah's movement was measured, deliberate, and full of silent authority. The crowd could feel it too. Their collective breath held, waiting for what would come next. Jake's smirk faded, replaced by a nervous tension he couldn't ignore. His chest tightened as the seconds ticked by, and for the first time, Jake realized he was no longer in control. He had challenged something much greater than his own ego, and Elijah's composed silence was teaching him a lesson he wasn't prepared for. "Hey, I'm just messing around," Jake said, his voice wavering slightly now. He laughed nervously, trying to deflect the growing discomfort. "You're just standing there like a robot. Relax, man." But Elijah didn't react. His eyes were still fixed ahead, his body still as a rock. But there was something undeniable about the power in his presence. It wasn't the physical force Jake had been expecting. It was the strength of discipline, the quiet power of a man who had learned to stand firm under any pressure. The crowd, still silent, was now watching with wide eyes, unsure if they wanted to see how far Jake would push it. A few people began to leave, murmuring under their breath, sensing that this moment was escalating into something dangerous. Jake stood there, facing Elijah, realizing with sudden clarity that he had made a mistake. This wasn't just about a prank anymore. This was about respect, discipline, and the strength to remain silent in the face of provocation. For the first time, Jake wasn't sure who had won the game. The air between Jake and Elijah had changed. For the first time since this whole ridiculous spectacle had started, Jake wasn't laughing. His confidence, once sky-high, had started to crumble. Elijah's presence, his stillness, his unwavering discipline sent a chill down Jake's spine. The crowd around them was now silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jake's friends had stopped laughing, and the tourists who had been eagerly recording the show on their phones now looked uncomfortable, some even turning away. They had seen the line Jake was crossing, and they knew things were escalating fast. Jake's hand was still shaking slightly, but he couldn't back down now. Not in front of his friends, not in front of the crowd. His ego wouldn't allow it. He had pushed and prodded, made every attempt to get a reaction from Elijah, and now he had come so close to breaking him. Elijah's silence, his perfect discipline, had become the real challenge. Jake's need to prove that he could win, that he could make the royal guard react, overpowered any sense of caution or reason. But Elijah wasn't just any man. He was a royal guard, trained for moments like this, moments when the world seemed to bend and shift around him, when people would challenge his composure and see if they could break his focus. Jake's words, his taunts, his childish actions were just noise, temporary distractions. Elijah had learned to block all of it out. For a brief moment, Jake thought he had won. The guard hadn't moved. But that's when everything shifted. Elijah's posture changed subtly, but significantly, almost imperceptibly, and Jake felt it. It was as though Elijah had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Jake to cross the line, to push him just far enough that Elijah's calm would finally break. Jake didn't see it coming. Elijah took one precise step forward, the sharp click of his boots against the stone floor echoing in the dead silence of the crowd. The air around them seemed to go still. The realization hit Jake like a punch to the gut. The energy had shifted. Completely. The crowd, once amused by Jake's antics, was now tense, waiting for what would happen next. There was no more laughter, no more smirking, just the heavy weight of Elijah's quiet authority. Jake froze. He could feel the blood drain from his face. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the situation. For the first time, Jake felt small. The feeling was unfamiliar, disorienting. He had never been challenged like this. He had spent his entire life assuming that his money, his status, and his privilege would protect him. He had thought that nothing and no one could touch him. But Elijah wasn't afraid of him. He wasn't intimidated by his taunts or his actions. Elijah had been trained to remain disciplined, to stand firm, no matter the provocation. Jake's arrogance, his belief that he could push anyone and everyone, suddenly felt fragile. The words he had been about to say, the taunts still lingering on the tip of his tongue, now felt hollow. He swallowed hard, but he still didn't back. "Down! I'm just messing around," Jake muttered, trying to laugh it off, his voice unsteady. He waved his hands dismissively, but the unease was now visible in his eyes. "Relax, man. It's just a joke." But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't speak. His eyes never wavered from their focused, straight-ahead gaze. The guard had not broken. He had not moved. Not out of anger, not out of frustration, but simply because he didn't need to. His strength was in his silence, in his unwavering commitment, to his role, to his duty. The crowd was still silent, watching with wide eyes. Some people were shaking their heads, others just staring at the two of them in stunned silence. Jake glanced at his friends, expecting some sign of support, but they were no longer laughing. Their expressions had changed from amusement to concern. They too were beginning to realize that this wasn't just a game anymore. Jake's heart was racing now, but his ego still refused to let him retreat. He wanted to see Elijah crack. He needed to see him react, to break the stoic composure that had held firm for so long. But as he stepped closer to Elijah, the shift in the guard's stance was all too clear. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't violent. It was the calm, controlled stance of someone who had waited long enough, someone who had the power to stop it all with a single move. And in that moment, Jake understood. Elijah wasn't just standing there as a guard. He was standing as a symbol of discipline, strength, and honor, and Jake had crossed the line. The game had ended, and now he would have to face the consequences. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had completely shifted. Jake, once full of arrogance and confidence, now felt small in the face of Elijah's unwavering discipline. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be out of control. The crowd that had once been amused by his antics now stood in tense silence, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with wide eyes. Jake's friends, who had laughed along with him, were no longer smiling. Their expressions had changed. To concern, their amusement replaced with realization. They, too, saw that this wasn't a game anymore. Jake had pushed too far. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His usual bravado was faltering, his ego bruised. The tension was thick in the air, and the weight of Elijah's presence was impossible to ignore. Jake had always been able to talk his way out of situations, to charm his way through life. But now, he was facing someone who was not intimidated by him, someone who stood firm without raising a hand or even a voice. Elijah's silence had become the most powerful thing in the room. Jake's mind raced. He thought he could continue pushing, that if he just kept taunting Elijah, the guard would eventually crack, would give him the reaction he so desperately sought. But with each passing moment, Elijah's stillness became more potent. Jake had never encountered someone so unfazed, so impenetrable. The realization was sinking in. No matter how much he tried, he could not break Elijah's composure. His hands were shaking slightly now, but his pride was still too strong to let him back down. "I'm just playing around," Jake said, his voice wavering slightly. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt hollow. "Relax, man. You're just standing there like a robot." The words came out weak, even to him. There was no laughter from the crowd anymore. Everyone was watching, their eyes trained on the standoff. Some were still recording, capturing the tension as if they knew something was about to happen. The quiet murmur of voices had disappeared. It was as if time had slowed, and the entire world had paused to witness this moment. Elijah didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his body as still and as disciplined as ever. The power of his silence was growing stronger with every second that passed. Jake felt the walls closing in, a growing discomfort gnawing at him. He had pushed too far. He had disrespected not just Elijah, but everything the royal guard represented. For a fleeting moment, Jake felt a rush of fear. It wasn't the kind of fear he was used to, fear of being caught or getting into trouble, but something deeper, something that came from realizing he had misjudged the entire situation. Elijah wasn't reacting because he didn't need to. His calm was a weapon, and it was enough to make Jake feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Jake shifted his weight nervously, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it was clear now, the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He had thought he could push Elijah, embarrass him, break him. But in the end, it was Jake who had been broken. Elijah took another step forward, his boots clicking against the stone ground. The sound echoed, sharp and deliberate, as if marking a shift in the entire energy of the moment. The crowd, still, silent, seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jake's eyes widened, his mind racing. Elijah wasn't angry. He wasn't even speaking. He was simply moving with the same calm precision that had marked his every action. And it was enough to make Jake feel the weight of his own arrogance. For the first time, Jake wasn't in control. The arrogance that had guided him throughout his life seemed insignificant in the face of Elijah's calm power. The realization hit him hard. There was no way to provoke this man. No words, no actions could break the strength of discipline Elijah had mastered. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but his words caught in his throat. The confidence he once had was gone, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable understanding of his own mistake. For the first time, he saw Elijah not as a figure to mock, but as a symbol of strength, discipline, and respect. The silence was broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps, security officers. The moment had reached its peak, and the consequences of Jake's actions were now inevitable. He had crossed a line that could not be undone. His friends, once encouraging him, now stood back, their faces full of concern. There would be no laughing this time. The reality of the situation had set in, and Jake was about to face the consequences of his behavior. As the officers arrived and Jake was escorted away, the crowd began to murmur once more. Some were still recording, but this time their expressions had changed. There was no more amusement, no more judgment, just the quiet, palpable tension of a lesson learned too late. Elijah remained where he stood, silent, resolute, and unshaken. His professionalism had spoken for itself, and Jake, for the first time, understood the true meaning of strength. What a powerful and intense moment, right? Jake's arrogance led him down a dangerous path, and it wasn't until Elijah's unwavering discipline showed him the true strength of respect that the reality set in. Have you ever faced a situation where you pushed someone too far, only to realize you crossed a line? What's the most powerful lesson you've learned from your own actions or from witnessing others? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and share any personal stories or insights about times when you or someone else learned the hard way about respect and discipline. This story is more than just about one person being put in their place. It's a reminder that sometimes silence and strength are the most powerful responses to provocation. What did you think about Elijah's calm response? Do you think Jake learned the lesson, or do you think it will take more for him to change? Let us know what you think. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can join us for more impactful stories. We'll see you tomorrow with another story that will make you reflect on life.